Okay, this is video 2 of 2. And hopefully this will be the second and last portion of this lecture. Sorry about that, a little bit of a tech problem. So I was in the middle of talking about religious toleration being a key aspect of the Dutch New Netherlands. And if you look at, by the way, and you can see this is how we can see some of the Dutch heritage of New York all the way to today. If you look at the map called the Castello Plan, so if you scroll down to the third slide, we can see that even the patterns of settlement in early Manhattan, some of them we can continue to see today in the street grid of New York City. So that map is the lower tip of Manhattan. So at the time, a map of New Amsterdam before it became New York City. And just a couple of things to point out. First of all, the bottom tip of Manhattan. So what you see there is primarily what today we'd call the financial district and Battery Park. Battery Park is where that square structure is, sort of in the top left center. That's a fort that was called Fort Orange by the Dutch. It was later called Fort William by the British, and we'll talk about the transition from Dutch to English rule. But that's now called Battery Park. And if you look at that broad street that goes from left to right from that fort, that's Broadway today, which is originally a Dutch term, which means wide path. And if you look at the street that goes directly top to bottom on the right-hand side of the screen, that is Wall Street today. And if you look closely at that image, you can see that originally there was a wall built there, hence the name Wall Street, which was intended to protect from attacks by Native Americans. And we'll talk again more about Native Americans in a second in this region. So just a couple of things to point out, some areas of interest to look at New York, what would become New York City in the 1660s, and there's still some of the heritage of it, of Dutch colonization, original Dutch colonization. One other point to make, by the way, if you look at the modern map of Lower Manhattan today, it's much larger than it originally was. And that's because Lower Manhattan was filled in over time to make it larger, to make the bottom tip of Manhattan larger. So that's not the shape that it has today. It's much larger than it originally was. So if you go down to the fourth slide, I'm going to take a step back and sort of set us up for the English takeover, if you will, of Dutch New Netherlands, the colony, and New Amsterdam, the town, and its transition to English. But to do this, we've got to take a step back and think about, just survey, just quickly, what the state of English colonial policy circa, which is what CA means, around 1660. And this is a good point to sort of take a step back and think about what we've talked about so far in terms of Virginia and New England, because as you know, as of 1660, Virginia had been settled by the English for 53 years, beginning in 1607. And the foundation of Massachusetts, the colony of Massachusetts, had been founded 40 years before. You remember the Pilgrims in 1620. So we're several decades into the establishment of English colonies in North America. And so it's, I think, useful to give us a little bit of a survey. What were the English from England thinking in this early stage, several decades after the first establishment of colonies in North America? And the reason that we start here with the year 1660 is because that there was a political change in England. A new king was crowned in that year, Charles II, who brought a very different kind of colonial policy than had preceded him. And you can read more about this in Chapter 3, Section 2 of American Yop, Chapter 3, Section 3, of American Yop. But just quickly, in the 12 years before Charles became the king, England was not ruled by a monarch, but was in fact ruled by a council called the Directorate, which was the result of the English Civil War. Again, you can read about that in more detail in Chapter 3 of American Yop, Section 3. This directorate, so a ruling council rather than a king or a queen, the result of the English Civil War, had a colonial policy that was pretty scattershot and not coherent, in part because conditions in the mother country, in England itself, were so shaky, unsettled, that not much mind was paid for the years between 1648 and 1660 to the colonies. That changed with Charles II. He specifically, getting down to some of the subpoints, aggressively promoted investment in English colonial expansion. He encouraged Virginia to expand rapidly, and in particular, encouraged Virginia to expand the institution of slavery, which he believed made the colony more profitable. If you remember all the way back to the first, I believe, the second week of class when we discussed Virginia, and I talked about slave laws in Virginia, they all began to emerge after 1660. Why? Because King Charles promoted colonial expansion, and in places like Virginia, promoted the growth of slavery because he believed it would make them more profitable colonies. And for Charles II, more profitable colonies meant more revenue coming into his personal treasury, which would reinforce his royal power, make him more powerful. And this is a specific policy that Charles II had. And this is the beginning of a system that we call mercantilism. And that's a term you've probably heard before, I think. I know that it's part of the curriculum in New York State high schools. So depending on where you went to school, you're probably familiar with that term. But mercantilism, or mercantilism is usually how it's pronounced incorrectly. Mercantilism was a system in which the mother country, England, promoted the growth of its colonies in the Americas. And here we're talking about North America, of course, but this also included the Caribbean, colonies like Barbados, for example, and later Jamaica, promoted the growth of these colonies, but especially those colonies like Virginia with tobacco, or like in the Caribbean, as I just mentioned, Barbados and Jamaica, two colonies where slavery was a significant institution and in which enslaved laborers were forced to work upon sugar plantations. Colonies that produced valuable commodity crops, which were produced in the colonies, primarily using slave labor in Virginia, as we've discussed, which were then sent to the mother country so that the mother country could profit from them. It's the system of mercantilism, that the mother country promotes the growth of its colonies across the ocean in the Americas so that the goods that are produced by the colonies are then shipped to enrich the mother country. So if you've learned about this before, it's usually expressed as colonies exist to enrich the mother country. And that's what we see Charles II promote. The main mechanism for doing this is the Navigation Acts, which you can see as the second main subpoint, or the second main bullet point. These were a series of laws. Actually, the first one passed before Charles became king, as you can see in 1651, but which Charles immediately strengthened in 1660, the year he became king, and again in 1663. These Navigation Acts, you see, the purpose was to increase the crown revenue, the king's revenue, royal revenue from colonial trade by emphasizing the protection of what were called enumerated commodities. Again, those commodities which were most valuable in England and in Europe, but which were produced in North America and the Caribbean. And so what these Navigation Acts decreed is that colonists who produced, or to be much more accurate, colonists which owned plantations who forced enslaved laborers to produce so-called enumerated commodities like tobacco and sugar, by law, as according to these Navigation Acts, had to send those commodities only to England. They were not allowed to sell them to any other merchants of any other nation. So, for example, after these laws were passed, the Navigation Acts, tobacco planters in Virginia, just to take a familiar example, who had previously sold their tobacco to Dutch merchants, were no longer legally allowed to do so. So this was a way of tightening the flow of commodities so that the King, Charles II, could profit as much as possible from them. And if you look at the two images below, slide 4 on slide 5. I always get a chuckle out of them. Those are two images of Charles II. The one on the left is his coronation portrait from the year 1660s, the official portrait made upon becoming king. And the right one is interesting. It's a modern recreation, 3D recreation based on portraits of what Charles would look like in person. And the reason I crack up, to be completely honest, is if you the hair, which is not real, just to be clear. And also, if you look closely on the right, the image on the right, which I'm going to know, you can see that Charles is holding a dog. So if you like dogs and you're familiar with the breeds, you may have heard of the King Charles Spaniel. That sometimes they're called Cavalier Spaniels. That's because they were Charles' favorite dogs, and that's what he's holding, his little dog. And he's wearing his very colorful clothing, which he was known for. And his wig. So if you're curious, that's what Charles II looked like. But I bring this point up now about this change in English colonial policy because this had a direct impact on New York. So if you flip down to the next slide, you can see that as a part of this general shift towards trying to promote colonial expansion, what Charles and his advisors realized when they looked at the map of North America was that they had colonial holdings in New England and also colonial holdings in Virginia, but in between them, most dangerously was the Dutch colony of New Netherlands and the trading post of New Amsterdam. And so Charles II determined that he would conquer this colony and bring it into the fold of English colonial North America. And so that's what he did in 1664. You can see the title of that slide, New York, 1664. That's the year that England invaded. Charles sent a ridiculously large invasion force, much larger than was necessary, to conquer New Netherlands, but by capturing New Amsterdam, most importantly. And this is the beginning of New York's shift from being what to the Dutch as a whole was a relatively minor trading post to becoming, by the 18th century, a thriving British imperial seaport and eventually the single most important city economically in colonial North America. And of course, New York would ultimately become the sort of financial capital of the world. And you can really kind of date this back to England conquering the Netherlands and developing the trading post that they renamed from New Amsterdam to New York in 1664. And why New York? The colony, once it was conquered from the Dutch West India Company, was granted by King Charles to his brother, James, who was the Duke of York, who became the sole proprietor of the colony, meaning that Charles's brother, James, was given the exclusive right to govern the colony as long as it remained or developed into a productive economic asset for the English Empire as a whole. James, the Duke of York, which is where the York comes from in New York, never actually visited North America. He remained in England his entire life, but he was technically the proprietor of the colony. And in the transition from Dutch to English, just a couple of things that I want to point out, some changes and some continuities. The first is a continuity. The English continued their policy, the former Dutch policy of religious toleration, or religious tolerance, as a practical matter, not because James, the Duke of York, wanted to encourage on its own, per se, religious toleration, but because of the fact that by 1664, there were people from about a dozen different religions and variations of Protestant Christianity, including Catholic Christians, in addition to some Jews, as I mentioned, already living in New York. So that policy was continued as a practical matter, not to disrupt too much the economy of the new colony of New York. Unfortunately, for two other groups of people, we see, I think, negative outcomes in the transition from Dutch to English. The first is that women, as I discussed on the previous slide, who under Dutch law had explicit formalized economic degrees of economic independence, those were rolled back, or the word I use is curtailed. So that was a negative transition. And women were in the new colony, the new English colony of New York, were brought in line with the legal concept I talked about last class in Massachusetts, which is called coverture, the patriarchal legal structures that oppressed women. In the long run, just as significantly, the very small number of free people of African descent, free people of color who had gained freedom under Dutch rule, and who were considered free men, which didn't just mean that they weren't enslaved, but actually was a legal status that meant they could vote and own land, had those privileges revoked. So free people of color in the former New Amsterdam, in the transition to English New York, were not made slaves again, and I just want to be clear about that, but they had what rights they held under Dutch rule were stripped from them. So the ability to own land and the ability to vote for some men who had been freed were stripped away. So that's just one aspect that's in addition to the change in the experience of women that I think we would fairly today say were negative outcomes from the transition from Dutch to English rule. And actually, we'll just wrap up talking about New York by discussing New York and the experience that Native Americans had, the relations between Dutch and the Native Americans, and later English and Native Americans. And what separates the experience of English and earlier Dutch and Native American relations from relations between the English and Native Americans in Virginia, for example, or those of English and Native Americans in Massachusetts, which were both characterized by conflict. We discussed, for example, the uprising of 1622 in Virginia, which began the pattern of the displacement of Native Americans there. I didn't talk so much about, even though there's a slide about it, just for the purposes of moving along this week, didn't talk too much about English relations with Native Americans in New England, but they were also characterized by conflict. When in New England Puritans could not convince Native Americans to convert to Christianity, they used violence to force them out of the colonial regions of Massachusetts and other areas of New England. And the most egregious example of the use of violence is called King Philip's War, a war in what is now Massachusetts and Connecticut in 1675 and 1676, in which New England authorities mobilized the local military to inflict significant casualties on Native Americans with the intention of forcing them out of the coastal parts of New England. In New York and earlier in Dutch New Netherlands, there's a different story. There's a much more reciprocal relationship, give and take relationship between England and earlier Dutch authorities and the Iroquois nations, who were an alliance of 5 and later 6 tribes who were the dominant Native American force in what is today New York, especially upstate New York. The Iroquois nations were powerful, and for that reason, the Dutch, who, as I mentioned earlier, were primarily interested in trade anyway, but especially later, the English authorities could not use force to impose their will upon the Iroquois nations, and for that reason, we see a reciprocal relationship develop. Okay, each side, the English and the Iroquois, viewed the other as an ally for their own purposes. And that's what you see later, farther on down this slide. The Iroquois were viewed by the English as a valuable ally because the Iroquois center of power in upstate New York was in between, or I call it a buffer here, New York City and French colonies in the Great Lakes region in Canada. So the Iroquois were seen as a valuable ally. The flip side of that is that the Iroquois viewed the English as a valuable ally, and especially viewed the English as a valuable trading partner so that the Iroquois could expand their own influence amongst their long-standing Native American rivals in the Great Lakes region, who were the French allies. So there's French and their Algonquin-speaking allies, and there was the English and their Iroquois nations allies. So for this reason, we see much more of a collaborative, maybe that's a good word to use as well, relationship. And this relationship was made formal in the negotiation of a series of treaties called the Covenant Chain. Again, a series of formalized treaties between the English and their Native American allies, the Iroquois. You can actually see an image on slide 9 of an English depiction of the Grand Council, the ruling council of the Iroquois nations, with whom the English negotiated these treaties. These were mutual assistance pacts, meaning that the English and Iroquois agreed to support each other should they enter a war with their enemies. So if the English entered war with France, then the Iroquois would support them. If the Iroquois entered into war with their Algonquin-speaking allies, the English would support them. So this is very different from the case in New England or in Virginia. I could drink some of my iced coffee. So that's New York. And we'll return to the region of New York in a couple of weeks, most importantly when we talk about the origins of the American Revolution. But just to wrap this up, from the 1660s, from the time England conquered New York, what we see, as I referred to a little while ago, is New York rapidly become, and this would be true by the 18th century, one of the most important port cities in the Americas, and eventually the world. And we could talk more about New York in the United States when we get past the midterm. So I want to wrap up just briefly talking about Pennsylvania. And there's a couple of slides that attest to the uniqueness of Pennsylvania. And the most important place to start, and this would be slide number 10, is that Pennsylvania was very unique when compared to other English colonies because of its religious origins. Very different from New England, which, as we know, is a Puritan colony, and certainly from Virginia, which was really not founded for any particular religious reason. As we talked about, it was founded initially as a profit-making venture. Because Pennsylvania, or what its founder called, a colony that its founder called the Holy Experiment, was founded with a very different religious background, which is Quakerism. So Quakers is the name that's used to describe people who are part of this radical sect of Protestant Christians that emerged in England beginning in the 1640s and the 1650s. So this group was a radical offshoot of Protestant Christianity that ultimately would be the founding origins of Pennsylvania. But I want to talk a little bit about what Quakerism was, because it will really help us understand why Pennsylvania was so very different from New England or Virginia and the Chesapeake, or even from New York. Quakers were unique and in the 17th century despised because the core of their religious philosophy or theology, called the Inner Light theology, was so very different from the Anglican Church, the official church of the English nation. Certainly very different from Puritanism, which we talked about at length last week, or which I talked about at length last week. Quakers, who were highly critical of the hierarchical nature of the Anglican Church, believed that every person, and many Quakers believed this to transcend racial difference and ethnic difference, that every person had an inner light within them, and that all one needed to do to reach salvation was to communicate with, in this case, the Christian God, through their inner light. But the core belief that everybody has an inner light, this belief is much more egalitarian than Puritanism, as I mentioned, or than Anglicanism, which, for reasons that we've already talked about, did not have what we would kind of today consider to be a kind of positive view of personal spirituality. And just to bring up the Puritans again, I talked about them last class, and you wrote responses about Anne Hutchinson, who believed in a related concept called the concept of inner grace. Well, what happened to Anne Hutchinson? She was persecuted and expelled. What made the Quakers even more radical was that, rooted in this belief of the, again, so-called inner light, Quakers became the first people in a general sense to express anti-slavery views. Okay, that slavery was wrong on religious and moral grounds. Why? Because they believed that enslaved people had souls, or as they called them, inner lights, and therefore, or just like white English people did, therefore slavery was illegitimate. It's wrong to hold somebody else as a slave if every person has an inner light within them. Quakers also did not participate in social customs related to class, and they conspicuously did not. So just to take one example that I could choose of many. Quakers, again, because they believed everybody had an inner light within them, did not participate in class distinctions that were observed in the mother country, in England. Again, one example. It was customary for somebody from a lower social class to show deference to somebody of a higher social class anywhere in public or in private homes by tipping their hat to them and showing deference. And Quakers refused to do this. They didn't participate in these because they didn't believe that social classes were legitimate distinctions. They believed that they were artificial and therefore that they should not participate in them. Quakers, and this was what made them so threatening to authorities in England, were pacifists. They didn't believe in war. So they didn't pay taxes. They refused to pay taxes that were levied to finance an English war. These things made them very much persecuted in England. And actually, if you flip down to the image of the slide, you can see actually an image, or two images that testify to the early persecution of Quakers. And this is, if you take some time and you can zoom in a little bit on that text, you can read what the description says. It describes what the image is, the action of the image is, but I'll just briefly talk about it. It's so fascinating to me. Quakers were prohibited from practicing their faith in England publicly, to the point that early Quaker preachers who chose to spread their message in public spaces were heavily persecuted. And so what you have in this image is the case of James Naylor, okay, an early Quaker, who was persecuted for repeatedly trying to preach his Quaker beliefs in London in public spaces, on the street corners. And so he did this so many times that we can see ultimately what his punishment was. So the image on the left is the first punishment that James Naylor faced. So he was tied to a cart with a horse, which you can't see the horse, but it's out of the picture. There's a horse pulling that cart. He was tied to it and dragged around the city of London and whipped repeatedly as he was dragged around, which is what's happening to him on the left. Even more brutal, frankly, is what happened next to him after he continued to preach his Quaker faith in public. He was tied to the stocks, which is what's happening on the right, and he was actually was forced to undergo bodily mutilation. So it's hard to see with that image, but it's described also in the text. English authorities actually took a hot poker and they burned a hole in his tongue. Not funny, actually, because that would make him it would make it physically impossible for him to speak in public. Right? If you have a hole in your tongue, you can't speak. And he was branded as well on the face. So you can see how Quakers were treated. And for that reason, Quaker communities in the 1650s and 60s began to seek a way to establish a colony outside of England so that they could escape that persecution. If you flip back to the slide number 10, Quakers in England were greatly helped in this cause because they gained an elite convert to their faith, a man named William Penn, a man who was the son of Admiral, as you can see, Richard Penn, who was King Charles II's closest advisor and one of his best friends. This is how elite the Penn family was. This is a family that had extremely close connections to the King of England. Admiral Richard Penn's son, William, converted to Quakerism. And if you scroll down to slide 12, you can see a picture of William there in 1666 because he was disgusted with warfare. His father, Richard Penn, was made the royal appointee in charge of suppressing Irish rebellions of native Irish people in Ireland as England attempted to conquer Ireland. And William Penn was forced to participate in the murder of Irish peasants. And this disgusted him so much that he decided to convert to Quakerism because he was drawn to its pacifism. And so actually the portrait you see of William Penn is right before he converted, which we can tell because he's wearing armor. Quakers would never wear armor, and they would never carry weapons because they did not believe in violence, as we've discussed. This ultimately was a major benefit to Quakers because the Penn family was given, as you can see in 1681, a tract of land in North America, what is today Pennsylvania, which is where the name comes from. Penn and Sylvania. Sylvania means woods, so then Pennsylvania means Penn's woods. Was given this tract of land by the King of England, Charles II, in repayment for a personal debt that he owed to the Penn family. The Penn family had loaned him significant amounts of money. Rather than repay them in cash, he gave them the right to found their own colony as the proprietors, a proprietary colony in North America, just to the south of New York. And this right was inherited by William Penn when his father died. So what William Penn decided he would do is found a colony, and we can go down to slide 13, this will be the last slide for today, that he viewed as a holy experiment. The quotation that you see on the first subpoint on slide 13 is a quotation from William Penn himself. This is a vision, for Pennsylvania. He wanted to create, quote, a free colony for all mankind that should go thither, which means there. So a free colony for all mankind that should go there. And what he meant by free was religious freedom, true religious freedom. Even more so than the religious tolerance of Dutch New Netherlands and later the continued policy of religious tolerance in English New York. We see true religious freedom in Pennsylvania. Furthermore, William Penn determined that his colonists, and he had the authority to do this as the proprietor, must treat local Native Americans equitably. So he did not condone violence against Native Americans in Pennsylvania. He insisted, that his colonists that came to Pennsylvania buy land from Native Americans on fair terms, not cheat Native Americans in land transactions. He created a government which was much more democratic in terms of political participation, even than in Massachusetts, which, as I talked about last week, was quite democratic for its time. He was given the power to frame the government, and he created one that included a council appointed by himself, an advisory council, but more importantly, an assembly, a lawmaking body that was elected by all quote-unquote free men, meaning men who owned 100 plus acres of land, which was broadly democratic for men, at least. For as great as William Penn can sound today, he did not propose that women should be allowed the right to serve in the colonial assembly. This is still the 17th century. But the requirement that one owned 100 acres of land was very easy to fulfill in early Pennsylvania. Land was abundant and cheap. And so that's the origins of Pennsylvania. And we're going to come back to Pennsylvania, but specifically Philadelphia, the city that was planned by William Penn to be the center of the colony. We'll come back to it in discussing the American Revolution in a couple of weeks. So we'll go and stop there. The last slide, British North America 1688, is actually what I'm going to pick up with next class. you'll see the same slide on the next PowerPoint set of PowerPoint slides. So we'll just return to that. But again, apologies for Zoom. I don't know what's going on with it, but this video will reach you by the time class starts. As I said last week, this is a normal week, except for the fact that Zoom isn't working, and that I will post a discussion board response on Wednesday. Okay, so if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Otherwise, I will be in email communication with you both today, Monday, and on Wednesday. Okay, thanks.